Hello, I'm Capucine Morello. I'm head of the pulmonology department at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and I'm going to talk to you today about nocturnal capnography. Here are my conflicts of interest in connection with this presentation. I got a remuneration by Breas. So now we're going to move on to the practical aspect of reading nocturnal capnography. So I'm going to introduce you to the Centec software called VStat, where we're going to talk about the different values that I mentioned on the first theoretical part. So here we find the average value. I remind you that the threshold value is 50 millimeters of mercury. Here we find the peak, where the threshold value was 55 millimeters of mercury, and above all we find here the time spent at a PtCO2 greater than 50 millimeters of mercury, where the threshold value was 10%. So here we have a pathological criterion, which is the time spent at a PtCO2 greater than 50 millimeters of mercury. We will also have the values that interest us for night oximetry, with the average value here, which is 94%. The desaturation index, which is here 14 per hour, and then the time spent at a saturation below 90%, which is here 2%. And above all, we will look at the analysis of the curve, where we find here a period of localized alveolar hypoventilation, and which is associated with desaturations, with therefore a time spent PtCO2 greater than 50 millimeters of mercury, which is pathological. Here you see an example of a normal curve, where you will have to look at the value at the beginning of the recording. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the software determines the baseline here by the red dotted lines. This baseline is determined by the first point, during which the temperature of 42 degrees was reached. And often there is a warm-up time that continues with an average value that is more like 40 millimeters of mercury, and so we will have to manually modify the base value, the baseline, to bring it back up here. This is important because then we will look at the delta of 10 millimeters of mercury compared to the baseline value at wakefulness. So here you check the value of the PtCO2 at the beginning of the recording, which will allow you to guarantee the positioning of the sensor, and then you will check that the recalibration has been carried out. Here we have a green curve and a blue curve, and here is indicated the corrected drift, so there has been a calculation of the drift. And then you will look at the duration of the recording, which is here 6 hours without artifacts. So this is a normal route. You can see here the example of a tracing with a very significant localized increase in PtCO2, which rises to 57 millimeters of mercury with a desaturation in view, and therefore a significant alveolar hypoventilation here, probably related to episodes of REM sleep with an atony of the extradiaphragmatic muscles. We will be able to analyze here brief desaturations without modification of the PtCO2 in connection with very probable obstructive events. Here you see the example of alveolar hyperventilation, where the patient starts at a PtCO2 at 34 millimeters of mercury, and then it will gradually decrease to 26 millimeters of mercury. It is a real alveolar hyperventilation, which, you see here, is hard in a quadriplegic patient under implanted phrenic stimulation. So as I mentioned, we will have to ensure the quality criteria of the recording. A recording of 4 hours or more is required. Ensure the registration conditions. Was the patient registered on spontaneous ventilation or NIV? And if he was registered on NIV, you need to know at what time he started his NIV and at what time he fell asleep, since what interests you is the value of the capnography when the patient sleeps on NIV. And so if there is a big difference between the time he put on his sensor and the time he fell asleep, you will have to remove this recording time from the total recording, since these are values that will not interest you, since it will be a capnography when awake and without NIV. It is also necessary to make sure that the quality of the night was identical to the usual nights. That is, if the patient did not sleep, you will have a false assessment of the capnography. I mentioned the position of the sensor. The position of the sensor is evaluated by the baseline value of the PtCO2. And finally, we have to make sure that we calibrate at the end of the night, which will allow us to calculate the drift and finally the duration of the artifacts. I mentioned the positioning of the sensor. It is important because if there is a presence of hair or if the sensor has been placed at the level of a piercing, there will be a presence of air bubbles which will underestimate the value of the PtCO2 since the air is naturally poor in CO2, and therefore ultimately there will be less CO2 which will interact with the electroelectric solution of the sensor. In the case of damaged skin and the presence of a scar or crust, there will be less CO2 diffusion, and therefore again an underestimation of the value of PaCO2 by PtCO2. Conversely, the PaCO2 will be overestimated in the event of pressure from the harness on the sensor, and therefore if the patient has a harness that passes over the earlobes. It is not recommended to put the sensor at the level of the earlobe since there will be an overestimation of the PtCO2. There can be errors in the sensor if there is a deposit in the sensor due to a contaminated sensor or a contaminated stall, or if cotton has been used, it will make a small deposit that will cause the presence of an air bubble. I had mentioned the warm-up time. The warm-up time can be determined here by the software. There will be a grayed-out part, but it may be longer than determined by the software. And so, on this recording of a TCM5, you see a warm-up time that lasts 15 minutes, and you will have to posteriorize this value from the overall calculation of the average of the PtCO2, otherwise you will have an underestimate of this average. You will also have to delete all the artifacts in post-processing. You see here in pre-processing the software has removed the heating time until the sensor reaches 42 degrees, so the skin reaches 42 degrees, then there is the sensor that has moved, so we remove these artifacts. So you see here a technical error. There was no recalibration at the end of the view. We only have a green curve and therefore we will not be able to give an average PtCO2 value or spike. On the other hand, we will be able to analyze the evolution dynamics of PtCO2 with an increase for PtCO2 because the kinetics remain the same. There is no calculation of the drift, so we can't give a value, but we can analyze the kinetics of the PtCO2. Here, there are various errors. You see that the baseline value of PtCO2 is 35 mm of mercury. That means that the sensor is badly positioned. In fact, it's so badly positioned that there's going to be a huge artifact here that's going to go up to 100 mm of mercury. And as a result, the automatic scale will go from 29 to 107 mm of mercury, which will totally mask the 3 episodes of alveolar hypoventilation, a significant increase in PCO2. And so all this will make this recording uninterpretable. Finally, one last example of a badly positioned sensor that moves, and that at times is not in good contact with the skin, and therefore this recording has to be started again with artifacts that are very important. A sensor that probably has an air bubble at its level and a recording time that is therefore insufficient. We will now move on to clinical cases. I present to you this first clinical case. This is Mr. J, 37 years old, who has congenital alveolar hyperventilation syndrome or Ondini syndrome, who was diagnosed at the age of 37 after his son had acute respiratory distress at birth, which led to the diagnosis of Ondini syndrome in his son. And when a child is diagnosed with Ondini syndrome, which is looked for in the parents, the presence of Ondini syndrome, and therefore a FOXB mutation that has been diagnosed here in this patient in 37 years. In fact, he has been treated for 2 years for obstructive sleep apnea syndrome with CPAP. He did not report poor sleep quality, very good sleep, no dyspnea, no breathing, and when he was given an arterial blood gas, it was normal. We did a night oximetry under CPAP, and you can see that this night oximetry is catastrophic with very prolonged and deep desaturations of up to 70%. When you look at his CPAP compliance record, you see that he has a CPAP of 4 to 10 centimeters of water. He has a syndrome of a hypopnea-apnea index of 6.6 per hour, mainly related to obstructive apnea according to the software. We can see that he is not very observant with a median compliance of 3 hours 35 minutes, an average compliance of 1 hour 21 minutes. And here you see the compliance profile. If we look a little closer on the night of December 4th, we see that the pressure peaks at a maximum of 10 centimeters of water, and that the software records a large number of obstructive apneas. When you look in detail at these obstructive apneas, you see that this drop in flow is prolonged. Here it's on a 10-minute scale. You can see that here, the patient is in apnea almost all the time, which is not quite classic for obstructive apnea. It does not last as long with a small flow that only passes after 2 minutes. He was given a nocturnal capnography where we see extremely severe nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation, with a baseline that was measured at 62 millimeters of mercury, but in fact it is rather around 58 millimeters of mercury. So alveolar hyperventilation already in the evening begins the recording, and this alveolar hypoventilation, which majors during the night in a very significant way, is concomitant with desaturation, and you see values that go up to 76 millimeters of mercury. When we look in detail, the average of the PtCO2 is at 70 millimeters of mercury, the maximum at 77 millimeters of mercury, so extremely severe alveolar hypoventilation, and it spends 100% of the time to a PtCO2 greater than 50 millimeters of mercury. This patient was eligible for non-invasive ventilation and not CPAP. The apneas that were considered obstructive by the software were in fact central apneas in a patient with Odine syndrome. The second clinical case, whereas if I come back to that case, you see that he didn't have hypoventilation when he was gassed when he woke up in the morning. If he had been given a blood gas at the end of the day, he would probably have had alveolar hypoventilation. I will return to the second case. It is a 60-year-old woman who has Steiner's myotonia diagnosed in 2003. Long-term non-invasive ventilation was started in 2022 due to asthenia, headaches and nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation. She did not have daytime alveolar hyperventilation. We started with an EPAP at 21 centimeters of water, EPAP at 4 centimeters of water and a backup frequency of 12 per minute. 1 month after the startup, the backup frequency was increased to 14 due to the persistence of hypoventilation at night. At 12 months, the patient is observant. She complains of morning fatigue. She was given an arterial gas test in the morning. She was at 45 millimeters of mercury. When you look at the data of the ventilator, she's set up on a Vivo 45. You see that there are episodes of leaks here. And apart from leaks, there are drops in flow. If we look in more detail, you can see that on the total flow rate as well as on the patient flow, we have here, for example, drops in flow, and the ventilator switches to the backup frequency. These early falls are repeated very frequently. See here, patient to leak-free flow drops with a safety frequency. When nocturnal capnography is performed, there are very repeated periods of alveolar hyperventilation, and these areas of alveolar hyperventilation are subject to desaturation, probably in connection with central apnea, and indeed, if we look at the thoracic and abdominal belts, these drops in flow were related to central apnea, total interruption of thoracic and abdominal movements, in connection with alveolar hyperventilation. We can clearly see here the alveolar hyperventilation, which results in central apnea with a progressive improvement in alveolar hyperventilation. Then again, as the patient was overassisted, again an alveolar hyperventilation, which again resulted in obstructive apnea with desaturations. If we move on to the third case, it is Mr. B, 67 years old, who has ALS with non-invasive ventilation that was started in 2019. Concomitantly with his ALS, he had been diagnosed with obstructive apnea of the summit. There were desaturations on the nocturnal oximetry, and when we looked at the data in the software, we found drops in flow that looked obstructive, and so we gradually increased the EPAP. With an EPAP of 17 and an EPAP of 7, a backup frequency of 14, and despite this increase in EPAP, there were persistent drops in flow. He was given an arterial gas test in the morning on spontaneous ventilation. A normal PaCO2 was found at 43 millimeters of mercury, and the patient reported good tolerance of NIV. And so in the face of these associated desaturations in connection with persistent drops in flow despite the increase in EPAP, we did a nocturnal capnography. And again, you see, we find alveolar hyperventilation that results in central apnea. And that was the drop in flow with repeated desaturations. These apneas made it possible to gradually correct the alveolar hyperventilation up to 41 millimeters of mercury. But as there was an overemphasis on ventilation, again the patient found himself with alveolar hyperventilation with the values of PtCO2 reaching 30 millimeters of mercury when he exceeded the apneic threshold. There were again desaturations related to his central apneas and a correction of the PtCO2 which again decreased rapidly, and therefore in this patient, inspiratory pressure was reduced. The fourth case is Mrs. G, 68 years old, who has ALS. She does not complain of dyspnea or sleep disorders, but there is nocturnal desaturation and a vital capacity of 50%. She has no alveolar hyperventilation, no symptoms, and so she was given a nocturnal capnography in spontaneous ventilation. We find here an average of 58 millimeters of mercury, a maximum at a peak of 64 millimeters of mercury. You have the three criteria for nocturnal alveolar hyperventilation while it had no major desaturation. You see capnography here, so we should have removed these artifacts here that are related to sensor movements, but here we find severe alveolar hyperventilation when its saturation here was normal. And then there are associated with these periods of nocturnal hyperventilation brief episodes of desaturation, localized here and here, probably in connection with obstructions that are not associated with an increase in PtCO2, since these are brief events, as we said earlier, which are not detected by capnography because they are too brief, probably related to obstructions. So in conclusion, it is important to check the technical quality of the recording since there are many errors related to the position of the sensor, a sensor that is poorly fixed, but also related to a lack of recalibration for the Syntake device. It requires having internal procedures for providers with training, technician education, and patient education so that they can position their sensor correctly. When we go to analyze the recording, we will first analyze the curve. As you have seen, the curve allows you to check the quality of the recording, the calculation of the drift, and to have an idea of the alveolar hyperventilation. Then, we will look at the values of the average PtCO2, the value of the peak, and the time spent at a PtCO2 above 50 millimeters of mercury. It's important for prescribers to recognize mistakes. Thank you for your attention.